Mao Zedong thought, or Maoism, is a political theory derived from the teachings of the Chinese political leader Mao Zedong. Its followers, known as Maoists, consider it an anti-revisionist form of Marxism-Leninism, developed from the 1950s until the Deng Xiaoping reforms in the 1970s. It was widely applied as the guiding political and military ideology of the Communist Party of China, and as theory guiding revolutionary movements around the world. The essential difference between Maoism and other forms of Marxism is that Mao claimed that peasants should be the essential revolutionary class in China, because, contrary to their industrial working comrades, they were more suited to establishing a successful revolution and socialist regime in China. Origins. The modern Chinese intellectual tradition. The modern Chinese intellectual tradition of the turn of the 20th century is defined by two central concepts: iconoclasm and nationalism. Iconoclastic revolution, anti-Confucianism. By the turn of the 20th century, a proportionately small yet socially significant cross-section of China's traditional elite found themselves increasingly skeptical of the efficacy and even the moral validity of Confucianism. These skeptical iconoclasts formed a new segment of Chinese society, a modern intelligentsia, whose arrival, or as lauded historian of China Maurice Meisner would label it, their defection, heralded the beginning of the destruction of the gentry as a social class in China. The fall of the last Chinese imperial dynasty in 1911 marked the final failure of the Confucian moral order, and did much to make Confucianism synonymous with political and social conservatism in the minds of Chinese intellectuals. It was this association of conservatism and Confucianism which lent to the iconoclastic nature of Chinese intellectual thought during the first decades of the 20th century. Chinese iconoclasm was expressed most clearly and vociferously by Chen Duxi during the New Culture movement, which occurred between 1915 and 1919. Proposing the total destruction of the traditions and values of the past, the New Culture movement was spearheaded by The New Youth, a periodical which was published by Chen Duxi and which was profoundly influential on a young Mao Zedong, whose first published work appeared on the magazine's pages. Nationalism and the appeal of Marxism along with iconoclasm. Radical anti-imperialism dominated the Chinese intellectual tradition and slowly evolved into a fierce nationalist fervor which influenced Mao's philosophy immensely and was crucial in adapting Marxism to the Chinese model. Vital to understanding Chinese nationalist sentiments of the time is the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in 1919. The treaty aroused a wave of bitter nationalist resentment in Chinese intellectuals as lands formerly ceded to Germany and Shandong were, without consultation with the Chinese, transferred to Japanese control rather than returned to Chinese sovereignty. The negative reaction culminated in the May 4 incident, which occurred on that day in 1919. The protests began with 3,000 students in Beijing displaying their anger at the announcement of the Versailles Treaty's concessions to Japan, yet rapidly took a violent turn as protesters began attacking the homes and offices of ministers who were seen as cooperating with, or in the direct pay of the Japanese. The May 4 incident and movement which followed catalyzed the political awakening of a society which had long seemed inert and dormant. Yet another international event would have a large impact on not only Mao but also the Chinese intelligentsia was the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Although the revolution did elicit interest among Chinese intellectuals, socialist revolution in China was not considered a viable option until after the May 4 incident. Afterwards, to become a Marxist was one way for a Chinese intellectual to reject both the traditions of the Chinese past and Western domination of the Chinese present. Maurice Meisner, Mao's China and After, page 18. The Yunnan period. During the period immediately following the Long March, Mao and the Communist Party of China were headquartered in Yunnan, which is a prefecture-level city in the Shaanxi province. During this period, Mao clearly established himself as a Marxist theoretician and produced the bulk of the works which would later be canonized into the thought of Mao Zedong. The rudimentary philosophical base of Chinese communist ideology is laid down in Mao's numerous dialectical treatises and was conveyed to newly recruited party members. This period truly established ideological independence from Moscow for Mao and the CPC. Although the Yunnan period did answer some of the questions, both ideological and theoretical, which were raised by the Chinese Communist Revolution, it left many of the crucial questions unresolved, including how the Communist Party of China was supposed to launch a socialist revolution while completely separated from the urban sphere. Mao's intellectual Marxist development. Mao's intellectual Marxist development can be divided into 5 major periods. The initial Marxist period from 1920 to 1926, the Formative Maoist Period from 1927 to 1935, the Mature Maoism Period from 1935 to 1940, the Civil War Period from 1940 to 1949, and the Post-1949 Period, following the revolutionary victory. The initial Marxist period from 1920 to 1926. Marxist thinking employs immanent socio-economic explanations. Mao's reasons were declarations of his enthusiasm. Mao did not believe education alone would bring about the transition from capitalism to communism because of 3 main reasons. Psychologically, the capitalists would not repent and turn towards communist on their own. The rulers must be overthrown by the people. The proletarians are discontented, and a demand for communism has arisen and had already become a fact. These reasons do not provide socio-economic explanations, which usually forms the core of Marxist ideology. The Formative Maoist Period from 1927 to 1935. In this period, Mao avoided all theoretical implications in his literature and employed a minimum of Marxist category thought. His writings in this period fail to elaborate what he meant by the Marxist method of political and class analysis. Prior to this period, Mao was concerned with the dichotomy between knowledge and action. Now, he was more concerned with the dichotomy between revolutionary ideology and counter-revolutionary objective conditions. There was more correlation drawn between China and the Soviet model. The Mature Maoist Period from 1935 to 1940. Intellectually, this was Mao's most fruitful time. The shift of orientation was apparent in his pamphlet, Strategic Problems of China's Revolutionary War. This pamphlet tried to provide a theoretical veneer for his concern with revolutionary practice. Mao started to separate from the Soviet model, since it was not automatically applicable to China. China's unique set of historical circumstances demanded a correspondingly unique application of Marxist theory, an application that would have to diverge from the Soviet approach. The Civil War period from 1940 to 1949. Unlike the mature period, this period was intellectually barren. Mao focused more on revolutionary practice and paid less attention to Marxist theory. He continued to emphasize theory as practice-oriented knowledge. The biggest topic of theory he delved into was in connection with the Changfeng movement of 1942. It was here that Mao summarized the correlation between Marxist theory and Chinese practice. The target is the Chinese Revolution. The arrow is Marxism-Leninism. We Chinese communists seek this arrow for no other purpose than to hit the target of the Chinese Revolution and the Revolution of the East. The only new emphasis was Mao's concern with 2 types of subjectivist deviation: dogmatism, the excessive reliance upon abstract theory; empiricism, excessive dependence on experience. The post-1949 period, following the revolutionary victory. The victory of 1949 was a confirmation of theory and practice. Optimism is the keynote to Mao's intellectual orientation. In the post-1949 period, Mao assertively revised theory to relate it to the new practice of socialist construction. These revisions are apparent in the 1951 version of On Contradiction. In the 1930s, when Mao talked about contradiction, he meant the contradiction between subjective thought and objective reality. In Dialectical Materialism of 1940, he saw idealism and materialism as two possible correlations between subjective thought and objective reality. In the 1940s he introduced no new elements into his understanding of the subject-object contradiction. Now, in the 1951 version of On Contradiction, he saw contradiction as a universal principle underlying all processes of development, yet with each contradiction possessed of its own particularity. Components. New democracy. The theory of the new democracy was known to the Chinese revolutionaries from the late 1940s. This thesis held that for the majority of the peoples of the planet, the long road to socialism could only be opened by national, popular, democratic, anti-feudal and anti-imperialist revolution, run by the communists. People's War, holding that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Maoist thought emphasizes the revolutionary struggle of the vast majority of people against the exploiting classes and their state structures, which Mao termed a people's war, mobilizing large parts of rural populations to revolt against established institutions by engaging in guerrilla warfare. Maoist thought focuses on surrounding the cities from the countryside. Maoism views the industrial-rural divide as a major division exploited by capitalism, identifying capitalism as involving industrial urban developed first world societies ruling over rural developing third world societies. Maoism identifies peasant insurgencies, in particular national contexts, were part of a context of world revolution, in which Maoism views the global countryside would overwhelm the global cities, due to this imperialism by the capitalist urban first world towards the rural third world. Maoism has endorsed national liberation movements in the third world. Mass line. The theory of the mass line holds, contrary to the Leninist vanguard model employed by the Bolsheviks, that party must not be separate from the popular masses, either in policy or in revolutionary struggle. To conduct a successful revolution, the needs and demands of the masses must be the most important issues. Cultural revolution. The theory of the Cultural Revolution states that the proletarian revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat does not wipe out bourgeois ideology. The class struggle continues, and even intensifies, during socialism. Therefore, a constant struggle against these ideologies and their social roots must be conducted. Cultural revolution is directed also against traditionalism. Contradiction. Mao Zedong drew from the writings of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels and Vladimir Lenin in elaborating his theory. Philosophically, his most important reflections emerge on the concept of contradiction. In two major essays, On Contradiction and On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Among the People, he adopts the positivist empiricist idea that contradiction is present in matter itself. Matter always develops through a dialectical contradiction. The interdependence of the contradictory aspects present in all things and the struggle between these aspects determine the life of things and push their development forward. There is nothing that does not contain contradiction. Without contradiction, nothing would exist. Furthermore, each contradiction expresses itself in a series of other contradictions, some dominant, others not. There are many contradictions in the process of development of a complex thing, and one of them is necessarily the principal contradiction whose existence and development determine or influence the existence and development of the other contradictions. Thus, the principal contradiction should be tackled with priority when trying to make the basic contradiction solidify. Mao elaborates further on this theme in the essay On Practice, on the relation between knowledge and practice, between knowing and doing. Here, practice connects contradiction with class struggle in the following way. Inside a mode of production, there are three realms where her practice functions. economic production, scientific experimentation, and finally, class struggle. These may be considered the proper objects of economy, scientific knowledge, and politics. These three spheres deal with matter in its various forms, socially mediated. As a result, they are the only realms where knowledge may arise. Mao emphasizes, like Marx in trying to confront the bourgeoisie idealism of his time, that knowledge must be based on empirical evidence. Knowledge results from hypotheses verified in the contrast with a real object. This real object, despite being mediated by the subject's theoretical frame, retains its materiality and will offer resistance to those ideas that do not conform to its truth. Thus, in each of these realms, contradictions must be identified, explored and put to function to achieve the communist goal. This involves the need to know, scientifically, how the masses produce, to obtain knowledge of how class struggle expresses itself. Mao held that contradictions were the most important feature of society, and since society is dominated by a wide range of contradictions, this calls for a wide range of varying strategies. Revolution is necessary to fully resolve antagonistic contradictions such as those between labor and capital. Contradictions arising within the revolutionary movement call for ideological correction to prevent them from becoming antagonistic. Three Worlds Theory states that, during the Cold War, two imperialist states formed the First World, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Second World consisted of the other imperialist states in their spheres of influence. The Third World consisted of the non-imperialist countries. Both the First and the Second World exploit the Third World, but the First World is the most aggressive part. The workers in the First and Second World are bought up by imperialism, preventing socialist revolution. The people of the Third World, on the other hand, have not even a short-sighted interest in the prevailing circumstances. Hence revolution is most likely to appear in Third World countries, which again will weaken imperialism, opening up for revolutions in other countries too. Agrarian Socialism. Maoism departs from conventional European-inspired Marxism in that its focus is on the agrarian countryside, rather than the industrial urban forces. This is known as Agrarian Socialism. Notably, Maoist parties in Peru, Nepal and Philippines have adopted equal stresses on urban and rural areas, depending on the country's focus of economic activity. Maoism broke with the state capitalist framework of the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev, dismissing it as revisionist, a pejorative term among communists referring to those who fight for capitalism in the name of socialism and who depart from historical and dialectical materialism. Although Maoism is critical of urban industrial capitalist powers, it views urban industrialization as a prerequisite to expand the economic development and socialist reorganization to the countryside, with the goal being the achievement of rural industrialization that would abolish the distinction between town and countryside. Maoism in China. In its post-revolutionary period, Mao Zedong's thought is defined in the CPC's constitution as Marxism-Leninism applied in a Chinese context, synthesized by Mao Zedong and China's first-generation leaders. It asserts that class struggle continues even if the proletariat has already overthrown the bourgeoisie, and there are capitalist restorationist elements within the Communist Party itself. Maoism provided the CPC's first comprehensive theoretical guideline with regards to how to continue socialist revolution. The creation of a socialist society, socialist military construction, and highlights various contradictions in society to be addressed by what is termed socialist construction, while it continues to be lauded to be the major force that defeated imperialism and feudalism, and created a new China by the Communist Party of China. The ideology survives only in name on the Communist Party's constitution. Deng Xiaoping abolished most Maoist practices in 1978. Advancing a guiding ideology called socialism with Chinese characteristics.